It was a cold Sunday morning when she stood in front of the old church doors, clutching a small bouquet of desert lilies. She didn't wear black, because she didn't own anything black. Her dress was beige and faded, hem frayed, sleeves too, short for the season. Her hair was tied in a rough bun, her skin kissed by the sun, just dark enough to be noticed, just enough for whispers to rise behind her back like smoke. The townspeople arrived in clusters, boots clicking on the stone path, their voices hushed only until they saw her. Then they weren't hushed at all. "What's she doing here?" muttered Mrs. Corbin, who sat front row every Sunday but never once spoke to the girl's mother. "That half-breed's got no place inside a church," said Tom Finley, spitting on the ground without shame. "She doesn't even have a name," someone whispered. "Only a mother who scrubbed floors and a father who, well, you know." The girl heard them, every word, but she didn't move. She stood tall even when a group of children snickered, and one of them mimicked an Indian war cry. One woman stepped forward and physically blocked the church door, spreading her arms wide like she was guarding heaven itself. "Go on now," she barked. "This service is for family. I am her family," the girl said, her voice soft but steady. "You are her shame," came the reply. Inside, the church was lit with oil lamps, the kind that made shadows dance. On wooden walls, the pews were filling quickly. The Reverend stood at the altar, nervously watching through the window. He knew her mother. Everyone did. Maria had cleaned this church for 14 years without ever asking for thanks. She had never missed a Sunday, though she always sat in the very back. She never asked for a real seat, only a place to kneel. Now her daughter wasn't even being allowed that. The Reverend came out. He looked at the girl with something close to guilt, maybe even pity. "Child," he began, "I don't want trouble today. Your mother deserves peace. She deserved respect," the girl replied. "She never got that either." He hesitated. "If you wait till after the service, I can say a prayer with you." But she had already turned. She walked down the steps with slow dignity, her eyes never meeting the crowd. Rain began to fall. Not a storm, just the kind of drizzle that soaked you over time. The petals of the lilies in her hands began to droop. No one stopped her. No one called her name. She didn't have one. Not really. Folks had always just called her that girl, or Maria's mistake. Her mother never told her much about her father, only that he was Cheyenne and brave, and that he left to protect them. The town had its own version of that story. As she passed the cemetery gate, she paused. She wasn't allowed inside the church, but no one guarded the graveyard. She knelt beside the fresh dirt, placed the flowers gently, and whispered, "I'm sorry, Mama. I tried." She sat there for a long time, letting the rain wash her face clean of everything she wasn't allowed to say. And far beyond the hills, down a trail of red dust and regret, a lone rider approached, his name long buried but his promise still alive. By Monday morning, the rain had dried into dust again, as if the sky had already forgotten the girl kneeling by her mother's grave. Dalton Creek moved on quickly. It always had. The town wasn't built for memory. It was built for survival, for silence, for people who looked like everyone else. She tried the bakery first. "I can sweep floors," she said, eyes lowered. Miss Langford, who made the best sourdough for miles, stared at her like she'd stepped in something. "We already got someone. I don't mind paying me less. Just want to work." Mrs. Langford didn't answer. She turned, mumbled something about health codes, and disappeared behind the swinging doors. At the tailor shop, she offered to stitch or hem. "My mother taught me," she said. Mr. Brody didn't even bother lying. "I got customers who don't want their clothes touched by your kind. You understand?" She nodded, even though she did. At the schoolhouse, she stood in line with others looking for cleaning work. The teacher, Ms. Avery, handed her a rag and said, "Scrub that floorboard over there." She knelt and did it, perfectly. But when her turn came to register, Avery glanced at the list and frowned. "You're Maria's girl." The girl nodded. Ms. Avery scratched out the name she had just written. "Position's been filled." No one met her eyes as she walked out. At the general store, she heard laughter. 3 young men lounged by, the barrels of feed laughing too loud. She knew their names, Clay, Earl, and Timothy, but they never knew hers. Didn't care to. "She tried to pray over her mama like she was one of us," Clay said, shaking his head. "Maybe she thinks if she talks wide and walks straight we'll forget what she is," Earl added. The girl didn't speak. She reached for a bag of flour on the shelf. Just as Timothy whispered, "I heard, her daddy scalped 3 men before vanishing into the night." "That ain't true," she said, barely above a whisper. "Oh, you speak now." Clay smirked. I said, "That ain't true." The smirk faded. He stepped closer. "Don't matter. People believe it. And that's all it takes." She dropped the flower and left without another word. That night she walked back to the small shack behind the cemetery, where she and her mother had lived for years. It was barely a home, more like a stable with walls, no windows, one cot, no firewood, just memories clinging to corners like cobwebs. She sat on the floor, pulled out her mother's sewing kit, and stitched a tear in her own dress by candlelight. Her fingers moved like habit, but her eyes burned. She hadn't eaten since Sunday. There was no money. No one would pay her. No one would feed her. But she didn't cry. Her mother used to say, "We don't beg, we endure." So she endured. The wind picked up that night, strong enough to rattle the boards and the walls. Somewhere out in the distance, a horse's hooves struck the earth in steady rhythm. No one in Dalton Creek noticed, but the dust was starting to rise. And so was the past. Dalton Creek wasn't the kind of town that kept records. It kept rumors. And in those whispers, her father was everything but real. They said he was Cheyenne. Some claimed Apache, others just a savage. No one ever said his name, not out loud. Only Maria's mistake or the Indian that vanished. In the corner of the saloon, under the oil lamp that buzzed with flies, old men leaned on their elbows and fed the legend. "I saw him once," grunted Mr. Caldwell, pouring himself another shot. Big shoulders, hawk eyes, quiet type. Wore a blade on his belt, not for show. "That blade took 3 scalps before breakfast," said a younger man trying to impress. "Boy," Caldwell snapped, "don't make things up. He never killed unless he had to." "Then where is he now?" someone asked. "If he cared so much, why'd he leave her here?" Caldwell didn't answer, just sipped, stared, and muttered. He had his reasons. Outside the saloon, the girl walked past slowly, eyes lowered, basket empty. The same men who gossiped about her bloodline fell silent when she passed, like their words had weight, only in the dark. She knew what they said, heard it her whole life, that her father had taken her mother like a wild animal takes a doe, that he vanished into the hills after getting what he wanted, that Maria was foolish to love someone so far beneath her. She had asked her mother once, only once, was he a monster? Maria had smiled, sad and soft. "No, Mia, he was quiet, gentle, braver than any man I ever knew. He didn't leave because he wanted to. He left because they were coming." The girl never knew who they were. Now, walking the same roads her father might have ridden years ago, she wondered if he'd ever truly existed, or if he was just another tale like the ones told in saloons over cheap whiskey. A woman at the well pulled her child away when the girl approached. At the mill, she asked for scraps. The man there handed her some grain husks, then wiped his hands like she was made of filth. No matter how many times she washed, the town only saw the part of her that couldn't be scrubbed off. That night, back in the shack, she lit a candle and unfolded the only thing she had of her father's, a piece of red cloth wrapped around a stone arrowhead. Her mother once told her it was part of a warrior's band. The girl didn't know if that was true, but it felt sacred in her hands. She held it tight, sat on the floor and whispered, "If you're still out there, I need something, anything." And somewhere beyond the hills, just past the border where law turned into legend, a man who hadn't spoken his real name in 20 years, lit a fire beside his horse and looked east. The wind carried something familiar that night, a pull, a memory, a voice he hadn't heard since the day he rode away under threat of death. He stood slowly, ran his fingers across the old knife on his belt, and whispered, "Maria." He didn't need directions. He knew it was time. The next morning, Dalton Creek stirred like it always did. Roosters cried before sunrise, boots shuffled across wooden porches, and dust clung to the hem of every dress. Children carried water, men spat tobacco, women watched from lace-curtained windows, pretending they weren't watching at all. But something felt off. The wind had changed. It came down from the northern hills in a way that made dogs whimper and horses uneasy. The air smelled less like prairie and more like memory, of smoke, pine, and something old enough to have been forgotten on purpose. That's when they saw him, a rider, alone. The first to notice was young Caleb, sweeping in front of the barber shop. His broom paused mid-stroke as a figure emerged from the horizon like a painting turning real. Tall, dark-coated, head lowered beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His horse was slow, deliberate, and silent. No saddle creaked, no sound but hooves tapping dry earth. Caleb ran inside to tell the others. By the time the stranger reached the well in the town center, 10 eyes were on him from every corner of Dalton Creek. He didn't look around, didn't tie his horse, didn't speak. He just stopped. He wore no badge, no guns on his hips, at least none visible. But there was a blade on his belt, old and worn, its hilt wrapped in the same kind of red cloth Maria's daughter kept beneath her pillow. Some swore they'd seen him before, others felt like they'd dreamed of him. In front of the general store, Sheriff Grady stepped forward. "Mornin', stranger," he said with a voice that tried to sound confident. The man tipped his hat, slightly, but said nothing. "You passin' through?" Grady asked. Still no answer. The sheriff shifted on his boots. "We don't like trouble here." That's when the man looked up and something in his eyes made Grady's voice catch. Not fear, not threat, just silence. The kind that said, "I've seen what you fear, and lived through it." The stranger pointed with a single gloved hand toward the far end of town. "She's still here?" he asked, voice rough like gravel soaked in whiskey and fire. "Who?" Grady asked. The man didn't repeat, he just waited. The sheriff looked around, confused. "You mean the girl?" A pause. That night, back in the shack, she lit a candle and unfolded the only thing she had of her father's, a piece of red cloth wrapped around a stone arrowhead. Her mother once told her it was part of a warrior's band. The girl didn't know if that was true, but it felt sacred in her hands. She held it tight, sat on the floor and whispered, "If you're still out there, I need something, anything." And somewhere beyond the hills, just past the border where law turned into legend, a man who hadn't spoken his real name in 20 years, lit a fire beside his horse, and looked east. The wind carried something familiar that night, a pull, a memory, a voice he hadn't heard since the day he rode away under threat of death. He stood slowly, ran his fingers across the old knife on his belt, and whispered, "Maria." He didn't need directions. He knew it was time. The next morning, Dalton Creek stirred like it always did. Roosters cried before sunrise, boots shuffled across wooden porches, and dust clung to the hem of every dress. Children carried water, men spat tobacco, women watched from lace-curtained windows, pretending they weren't watching at all. But something felt off. The wind had changed. It came down from the northern hills in a way that made dogs whimper and horses uneasy. The air smelled less like prairie and more like memory, of smoke, pine, and something old enough to have been forgotten on purpose. That's when they saw him, a rider, alone. The first to notice was young Caleb, sweeping in front of the barber shop. His broom paused mid-stroke as a figure emerged from the horizon like a painting turning real. Tall, dark-coated, head lowered beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His horse was slow, deliberate, and silent. No saddle creaked, no sound but hooves tapping dry earth. Caleb ran inside to tell the others. By the time the stranger reached the well in the town center, 10 eyes were on him from every corner of Dalton Creek. He didn't look around, didn't tie his horse, didn't speak. He just stopped. He wore no badge, no guns on his hips, at least none visible. But there was a blade on his belt, old and worn, its hilt wrapped in the same kind of red cloth Maria's daughter kept beneath her pillow. Some swore they'd seen him before, others felt like they'd dreamed of him. In front of the general store, Sheriff Grady stepped forward. "Mornin', stranger," he said, with a voice that tried to sound confident. The man tipped his hat, slightly, but said nothing. "You passin' through?" Grady asked. Still no answer. The sheriff shifted on his boots. "We don't like trouble here." That's when the man looked up and something in his eyes made Grady's voice catch. Not fear, not threat, just silence. The kind that said, "I've seen what you fear, and lived through it." The stranger pointed with a single gloved hand toward the far end of town. "She's still here?" he asked, voice rough like gravel soaked in whiskey and fire. "Who?" Grady asked. The man didn't repeat, he just waited. The sheriff looked around, confused. "You mean the girl?" A pause, then a single nod. Grady cleared his throat. "She's around. Not many places to go. Lives out by the graveyard. Nobody bothers her much." The man's jaw tightened at that last part. He turned, mounted again, and rode off without another word. Back at the store, Clay and Earl watched from the porch, whispering, "Think he's law? Nah, look at that blade. He's tribal. So why come back now?" No one had the answer. Down near the cemetery, the girl was hanging laundry, if you could call 2 dresses and a patched-up sheet laundry. Her hands were red from scrubbing, her face pale from hunger. She looked up when she heard the soft clop of hooves. The man didn't speak, just dismounted and stood there. She didn't run, didn't ask who he was, She only stared at the red cloth wrapped on his belt. Then with a voice that barely held together, she asked, "You knew her, didn't you?" He nodded once. "You knew my mother?" He looked past her, toward the cross of wood standing crooked behind the shack. "I made a promise," he said, and for the first time in years, the wind in Dalton Creek carried something heavier than dust. It carried a name no one had spoken since Maria died, and a reckoning that hadn't yet begun. They sat across from each other at the only table outside the old diner, a cracked wooden thing that hadn't seen company in years. It was still early, the sun barely brushing the rooftops, and most folks hadn't yet dared to step outside. But she knew they were watching. The whole town always watched when it came to her. He placed a tin cup in front of her. The steam still rose. "I didn't ask for anything," she said. "I know." She looked at the black liquid, wary. Then she looked at him. His face was cut from stone. Sharp lines, deep grooves from sun and silence. He looked like a man who'd buried 100 names and kept none for himself. His eyes, dark and unreadable, rested on her not with pity but with something heavier, something like memory. "Why are you here?" she asked. He sipped his coffee before answering. "Because I should have come sooner." She blinked. "You were gone before I was born." He nodded once. "Didn't mean I forgot." She clenched her jaw. "They said you left her, that you never cared. They lied." She laughed bitterly. "That's all people do here, they lie and watch." He placed his cup down carefully, like it held something more than coffee. "I knew your mother when her name still meant something, when her laugh could soften fire. I left because if I stayed she would have burned for being with me." "She burned anyway," the girl said, slowly. He didn't flinch, just said, "I know." The silence between them grew thick. In it she heard horses snorting, boots shifting behind the windows, whispers curling behind curtains. "Why now?" she asked. "Why show up now when it's all ashes?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a bundle wrapped in cloth, the same red cloth as the one around his blade. Inside, folded with care, was a photograph, faded, cracked at the corners. A young woman holding a baby with wide eyes and dark hair. Behind them a mountain, a memory. She stared at it as if it might vanish. "That's you," he said. "My mother never showed me this. She never had the chance. I sent it through someone I trusted. I guess it never got to her." Her fingers trembled as she traced the outline of the woman's smile. "She used to hum at night," she whispered, "when she thought I was sleeping, like she was holding something inside." She was. What? Hope. The word hit harder than anything else. For a long time they just sat there, two shadows in a town that had already buried them both in its mind. He reached for his cup again. "They still talk about her in this town. They pretend she never existed. They only remember what's convenient. And you, they call me a mistake. You're not." She looked up. "I made a promise to her that if she ever passed I'd come back for you no matter how long it took." She shook her head. "You don't owe me anything. It's not about what I owe. It's about what's right." A fly buzzed lazily around them. Somewhere down the road, a dog barked once and then fell quiet again. "I don't need saving," she said finally. "I'm not here to save you," he replied. "I'm here so you don't have to fight alone anymore." She looked away, blinking. Fast. "It's too late for all this." He stood slowly, the chair creaking behind him. "No," he said. "It's just late enough." And with that he walked toward the livery, leaving the photograph in her hands, and the warmth of the coffee still steaming between them. Proof that someone once remembered her mother's name. The days that followed weren't loud. They never are when something real begins to shift. He stayed on the edge of town, in the broken barn behind the livery. Didn't ask for a room, didn't sleep in the saloon, just laid down his saddle by the hay, and rested like a man used to being surrounded by ghosts. He didn't follow her, didn't pressure, just waited. She found herself walking by that barn more than once, pretending it was coincidence. Sometimes, he was sharpening his blade, sometimes brushing the dust from his coat, sometimes just sitting still, staring into nothing, like he was waiting for something only the wind could deliver. On the fourth morning, she brought him bread. He didn't smile, just nodded once. "Sit." They sat in the barn's open doorway where the light filtered through planks like broken stained glass. "You ever kill anyone?" she asked, eyes forward. "Yes, because they were white." "No." She waited. He didn't offer more, just tore the bread slowly. She spoke again. "Did you love her?" He answered without pause. "More than breath." "Then why'd you leave?" "They gave me a choice. Leave town or get buried beneath it. And you chose yourself." "I chose her." She turned her face to him then, confused. "If I stayed, They'd have killed me, and her. You wouldn't be here. She didn't reply. He took a slow breath. We made a pact. If she ever passed before I did, I'd come back and finish what we started. What was that? Making sure you'd never be erased. The words were plain, but they hit hard. She'd spent her life as a shadow, a mistake, a whisper. People spoke with lowered voices, and here sat a man who spoke like she was something that still mattered. She pulled the photograph from her pocket and looked at it again. Why didn't she go with you? She wouldn't leave the land. Said her mother was buried here. Said her hands were meant for these fields. They made her pay for that. He nodded slowly. They always do. In the quiet that followed, she asked the one question she had never dared ask aloud. What was her name to you? He turned to her. Salvation. That night he walked the edge of Dalton Creek like a ghost retracing old wounds. At the saloon, men fell silent when he passed. Clay leaned into Earl and whispered, I don't like him here. He hasn't done nothing. Not yet. In the churchyard he stood in front of Maria's grave. No stone, just a wooden cross weather-worn and splintering. He knelt. You were right. I should have come back sooner, but I'm here now. Then he did something no one saw. He pressed his forehead to the ground, a kind of prayer that didn't need words. Dalton Creek was a place built on silence, but lately it was the wrong kind of silence. Not peaceful, not respectful, tense, loaded, the kind that made men check the load on their rifles and women pull their children inside a little earlier than usual. He didn't threaten anyone, didn't raise his voice, didn't even look twice at those who muttered behind him, but he was still here, and that was enough. Each morning the girl saw him working, quietly, without asking. One day he repaired the broken well pump outside the chapel. Another he helped old man Traeger fix the wheel on his wagon, without ever being thanked. Then came the day he pulled a calf out of a ditch with nothing but a rope and willpower. The rancher only grunted and walked away, ashamed of his own hesitation. But people noted. They watched from behind curtains, from cracks in saloon doors, from church windows they hadn't cleaned since Easter. And every time he walked past, with those boots that didn't thump but whispered, he reminded them of something they didn't want to remember. Not the kind you could pay in coin. The girl, meanwhile, began walking with her head a little higher, not out of pride, but out of something she'd forgotten. Dignity. She wore the same dress, carried the same name or lack of one, but now people crossed the street instead of walking through her. It wasn't fear, it was uncertainty. At the bakery, Mrs. Langford now offered her day-old rolls. At the tailor's, Mr. Brody let her mend a torn hem, paid her in silence, and didn't stop her when she came back the next day. Even the sheriff avoided confrontation, just tipped his hat and kept moving. But not everyone was ready to forget. Inside the saloon, Clay slammed his whiskey down. We just gonna let this happen? Earl shrugged. What do you want to do? He hasn't broken any laws. He's walking around like he owns the place, fixing things, smiling at her like she's one of us now. She ain't, Timothy muttered. She's worse, Clay hissed. She's the symbol of everything this town buried and hoped never came back. In her shack, the girl lit a small lantern that flickered with more life than it should have had. The photograph stayed folded near her bed, the red cloth now wrapped gently around her wrist like a quiet shield. He knocked once on the doorframe. She turned, startled. I fixed the fence out back, he said. Figured it might keep the coyotes out. She nodded, unsure what to say. I'll be around, he added, then paused. Unless you don't want me to be. She stepped forward, voice almost a whisper. They're afraid of you. I know, they don't forget anything. Neither do I. She looked at him, really looked, not at the blade on his hip or the scars across his face, but at the man who had walked into fire just by showing up. And for the first time in years, she said the name she'd never dared to speak aloud. Father. He looked at her, not shocked, not moved, just present. Yes. No hug followed, no tears, just a shared stillness that held more love than most words ever could. Outside, the wind pressed against windows like a warning. Dalton Creek was watching, but for once she didn't care. Dalton Creek didn't burn often, but when it did, it burned slow and with purpose, like it was remembering something. The wind had been uneasy all day, the kind that twists into doorways and stirs curtains for no good reason. By dusk, the sky turned the color of blood and ash. Then sometime after midnight, smoke bloomed from the roof of the old church like a curse being released. It wasn't lightning, it wasn't an accident. Someone had waited for the town to sleep. The flames caught in the steeple first, a bright red cracking above the quiet town like a scream. The bell began to sway on its own, metal groaning as if the church was calling out in its final breath. By the time Sheriff Grady got there, barefoot and breathless, The whole roof was alight. People gathered in silence. Nightgowns, hats pulled on backward, eyes wide. Nobody carried water. Nobody moved. The heat licked their faces, but it was the shame in the air that made them sweat. Then someone screamed. It was her. She came running from the hill, feet bare, braid loose, dress flapping like wings, her eyes locked on the flames and the smoke. The place where her mother had knelt for years, unseen and unpaid. Inside were the only things she had left: the cross her mother polished, the hymnal she whispered over, the altar cloth she'd stitched by hand. Someone tried to grab her arm. She shook them off and ran into the fire. Gasps broke out. She's gone mad. Someone shouted, but no one followed her. They just watched. Inside, the church was choking on its own breath. Flames curled around, the windows hungrily eating what little wood was left. She dropped low, crawling across the aisle, coughing through the smoke. She found the altar cloth half burning, slapped the fire out with her palms, grabbed the small wooden cross. The hymnal, its pages already curling, was still under the front pew. Just as she turned, part of the ceiling groaned above her, and that's when he came. No one saw where he came from, only that suddenly he was there, the man with no name. He kicked open the back door of the church with a single boot, his silhouette, a dark cutout against the fire. He vanished inside. Seconds passed, then more. The Reverend looked away, some closed their eyes, and then, he came out with her in his arms, her dress singed, her arms still clinging to the cross and book, her face black with soot, but alive. The crowd parted in silence. She stood on her own feet, shaky but proud, holding what remained. The man didn't speak. He didn't need to. The Reverend walked forward slowly, eyes glistening. He looked at the burned hymnal in her hand and whispered, "She risked her life for this. She risked it for what you all forgot." The man replied, his voice like gravel and thunder. No one moved. Then quietly the Reverend knelt. "Forgive us," he said. "We forgot who taught us grace." The girl said nothing, but she stood taller. That night, Dalton Creek lost a church, but maybe, just maybe, it found its soul. The sun rose slowly over the charred remains of Dalton Creek's church. Smoke still clung to the air like guilt, and the pews now exposed to the sky looked like the ribs of a giant creature laid to rest. But something had shifted. By noon the townspeople had gathered again, but not to gawk or whisper. This time they brought tools. Miss Langford arrived first, carrying a broom and a bucket of soapy water. Then came Mr. Brody with spare wood. Even Sheriff Grady rolled up his sleeves, hammer in hand, though his face stayed red with something he didn't quite name. Maybe shame, maybe resolve. At the edge of the churchyard she stood quietly beside her father. She wore the same dress from the night before, now washed and drying in the breeze. A soft cloth was wrapped around her burned palms. Her braid was tighter, her eyes clearer. They didn't ask her to help. They didn't order her away either. Instead, Mrs. Langford walked up to her, slow and cautious, and said, "Would you help us sew a new altar cloth? Yours held together longer than any of us expected." The young girl blinked, unsure if she'd heard right. Then she nodded. "Yes, ma'am." A whisper traveled through the crowd, not gossip, recognition. By evening she was stitching with the women seated beside the same people who once turned their backs. No one said it, but they knew. She'd done something they hadn't. She had walked into fire for the very place that had cast her out. Respect, once denied, now sat quietly in the space between stitches.